imagine, right, that you are the CEO of this massive, globally dominant tech monopoly. Like, you have had absolute, just uncontested control over the entire market for decades.
Right.
Your infrastructure essentially runs the world. But then seemingly overnight, this scrappy group of independent developers using a radical new open source code completely dismantles your empire.
Oh, man. They don't just, take a little market share. They bankrupt you.
Exactly.
They seize your servers, your headquarters, like your entire user base.
They take over everything. You are utterly defeated. And the thing is, you can't beat them in the marketplace because, well, they've already won.
Yeah, the market is theirs.
Right. And you can't sue them in court because they literally are the court now. So what do? You don't try to build better software to fight them directly. Instead, you figure out a way to secretly inject a passive bug into their open source code.
A bug that doesn't crash their system immediately, right?
Right.
Because the crashing system triggers alarms, like people fix crashes.
Exactly. They fix crashes. This is it's a brilliant, insidious piece of malware. It just quietly convinces all the new developers that they don't actually need to write any new code anymore.
Right.
It tells them the system runs itself, that every glitch is actually a feature, and that they should just, sit back and let the program do whatever it wants. Over time, what happens? They stop updating.
You stop fixing errors.
Yeah, and eventually their entire invincible system just rots from the inside out.
That framing, I mean, honestly, it's arguably the best way to grasp the sheer scale of the historical argument Alama Parvez makes in the text we're diving into today.
It's wild.
It really is.
Okay.
Because our mission in this deep dive is to unpack Parvez's radical sociological reading of Quranic history and philosophy, relying on his extensive lectures and, textual extractions.
Right, because he isn't talking about software or Silicon Valley here.
No, not at all. He is talking about the fall of the ancient Persian Empire. And what he argues was the structural sabotage of the early Islamic socioeconomic system. And, get this, he locates this sabotage entirely in the realm of ideology.
But, how does a defeated empire pull off an ideological heist like that? To understand the geopolitical shock of this, look at the historical scene Parvez isolates in the source material.
Well, the encounter with Hormuzan.
Yeah. We are looking at the direct aftermath of the Arab conquest of Persia. We have the second caliph, Umar, standing face-to-face with Hormuzan. Now, Hormuzan was this immensely powerful Persian governor who is now just a prisoner of war, brought before the caliph.
Right.
And Umar interrogates him. He basically says, before this, you Persians didn't even consider us Arabs worthy of being your enemies. Like, we were a joke to you. Now your empire is gone, your emperor is fleeing. What changed?
And Hormuzan's answer is just, it's a masterclass in sociological observation. He doesn't say, you Arabs bred better horses or you forged sharper swords.
Yeah, no tactical stuff.
Exactly. He tells Umar that in the past, it was just Persians fighting Arabs. And the Persians always won because the Arabs were fractured. They lacked a cohesive system. But now, Hormuzan says, you have your God with you.
I want to pause on that phrase, you have your God with you, because on the surface, that sounds like something out of a mythological epic, like they literally summon a deity to fight on the battlefield.
It does sound like that, which is exactly why Parvez is just relentless in stripping away all the mystical, supernatural baggage from that phrase.
Right.
Hormuzan was a pragmatic political governor. He was not a mystic. When he said God was with them, he wasn't talking about a magical force field deflecting Persian arrows.
Yeah.
According to Parvez's analysis, Hormuzan meant that the early Muslims had aligned themselves with an objective, rational, universal law.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They had adopted a constitution. They suddenly had a socio-economic structure built on cause and effect, equity, and collective action. That structural alignment is what transformed a disorganized group of desert tribes into an unstoppable, unified force.
So the open source code in our analogy was this new socio-economic constitution.
Yes, precisely. Parvez points out that the Quran originally outlined a very streamlined active framework. It was just 5 core pillars of constitutional belief.
Just 5.
Just 5. Belief in Allah, the angels, the books, the prophets, and the Day of Judgment. That was it. It was a system of active, responsible, human agency.
Okay, so the Arabs used this active system to crush the Persian Empire. The Persians are defeated militarily. But how do they inject the passive bug? Like, you mentioned ideological sabotage, but I'm really struggling with the mechanics here.
It's tricky to conceptualize at first.
Yeah, I mean, how does a conquered people convince their conquerors to adopt a completely self-destructive belief?
Well, it requires looking at how empires actually function after the dust of conquest settles.
Hmm.
The Arabs conquered the physical territory, sure, but the Persians were the ones with centuries of administrative, bureaucratic, and philosophical infrastructure.
Right, they knew how to run things.
Exactly. So as the new Islamic empire expanded rapidly, who did they have to rely on to run the tax systems, to organize the state archives, to serve as advisors, and eventually to act as tutors to the elite, the Persians?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they integrated into the very nervous system of the new empire.
They became the system administrators of the new regime.
Precisely. And Parvez argues that over decades, operating within the Islamic Empire, this educated, culturally sophisticated yet defeated class slowly and methodically engineered a sixth pillar,
The passive bug.
the passive bug. They injected an idea that wasn't in the original five, and that sixth pillar was takdir.
Tagdir, which is
Predestination, fatalism, the belief that everything that happens, every success, every failure, every instance of poverty or wealth is already written by God.
hold on, you're telling me that one of the most widely held theological concepts in the world, like this whole idea of destiny, of divine plan, is essentially being framed by Parvez as a geopolitical psyop by a defeated empire.
Basically, yes.
That sounds like a massive historical conspiracy theory. Is he actually arguing this was a deliberate, conscious revenge plot?
Well, he is arguing that it functioned as one, whether every individual Persian administrator was consciously plotting it in a dark room or not. The psychological brilliance of it is what Parvez highlights.
Okay, walk me through that.
Think about it. If you want to defeat a society that believes it is responsible for its own socio-economic destiny, you cannot fight them with weapons. Because if a society believes that justice brings prosperity and injustice brings ruin, they will constantly strive to perfect their system.
Right, they'll always be iterating and improving the code.
Exactly. But if you can convince them that poverty, defeat, corruption, and failure are simply God's will, that it's all preordained, and there's absolutely nothing they can do to change it, you destroy their collective agency.
You paralyze them.
Completely paralyzed. They become the developers who stop fixing the bugs because they are convinced the bugs are divine features. They stop asking why their infrastructure is failing and start accepting it as a spiritual test. It's this incredibly effective mechanism of societal pacification.
You know, think about your own workplace or your own community for a second.
Right.
If someone told you that every time the server crashes or every time a community project fails, it was just destiny and couldn't be avoided,
You fire them.
you'd fire them immediately, right? Because nothing would ever get fixed. If the roof leaks, you don't call it destiny, you get a ladder and fix the roof.
Exactly.
But Parvez is saying that on a macro civilizational scale, this idea of takdir conditioned millions of people to look at a leaking roof and say, well, it is written.
It conditioned them to accept decay, just total stagnation.
Yeah.
And to understand why it was so easily accepted, we really have to look at the alternative. Because the original framework Parvez identifies in his analysis of Surah Fusilat is incredibly demanding.
In what way?
Well, it offers absolutely no comfort to the lazy or the corrupt. He divides existence into two very distinct domains to explain how universal laws actually operate, and he completely bypasses any supernatural framing.
Right. Let's get into the mechanics of these two domains, because this is where the text completely shifts the paradigm from theology to sociology.
Okay, so the first domain Parvez identifies is called Alam-e-Amar, which translates roughly to the realm of command. Today, we would just call this the realm of natural law, or the physical universe, like physics, chemistry, biology.
The stuff that just is.
Yes, the stuff that just is. And the defining characteristic of Alam-e-Amar is absolute determinism. There is zero free will here. Parvez uses specific, tangible examples from the text to explain this.
Like what?
Like water. Water has a fixed law, a fixed measure, which the text refers to as qadar. Now, up to a certain measure, water is life-giving. It hydrates the body, it irrigates crops. But if you exceed that measure, if you are completely submerged in it, that exact same water will drown you.
The water doesn't wake up and decide to show mercy to someone who can't swim.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't have a personality or an agenda. It just operates according to its chemical and physical properties.
Exactly. Fire has a fixed law to burn and provide heat. Gravity pulls masses together. These elements are completely bound by their qadar, their mathematical boundaries. They are essentially running on a fixed, unalterable script.
Okay, so that's the physical universe, deterministic, mathematically predictable. But obviously, human society doesn't operate like a chemical equation.
Which is why Parvez introduces the second domain, Alamein Kalk. This is the human socioeconomic sphere, and this is where the rules of the universe undergo a radical, unprecedented shift. In this sphere, humans are the ultimate exception to the determinism of the physical universe.
The exception why?
Because humans possess ikhtiar. That means agency, free will, the power of conscious choice. We aren't bound by a single fixed script like water or fire.
I'm trying to map this onto how we actually live. If humanity is the exception, if we have this absolute agency, what is the role of God in Parwez's reading? Because, the traditional view is a deity who manages the details, who answers specific prayers for rain or victory or health.
So Parwez's framework dismantles that traditional view entirely. In the human sphere, he argues, God acts purely as a systemic rule setter, not a micromanager.
A rule setter.
Yeah, it's a vast objective system of cause and effect. The overarching rules are established. If human beings use their collective agency to build a rational, just, equitable system, the mathematical output is prosperity and stability, period.
And if they don't?
If they use their agency to build an unjust, exploitative, corrupt system, the mathematical output is ruin, poverty, and collapse.
So it's almost like a massive physics engine in a video game simulation.
That's a really interesting way to put it. Let's explore that analogy. How does a physics engine work in that context?
Well, okay, the game developer, the rule setter, programs the gravity, the collision detection, the material strengths.
Right.
Gravity will function exactly the same way every single time a player jumps or drops an object.
Right.
The developer doesn't sit there watching you play, manually pulling your character down to the ground every time you jump. They just wrote the law of gravity into the environment.
And how does that relate to human agency?
If you, the player, design and build a bridge across a massive canyon in this game, and you calculate the weight loads correctly, the bridge stands, you cross safely.
You utilize the rules correctly.
Exactly. But if you build a structurally unsound bridge, if you ignore the laws of physics programmed into the engine, the bridge collapses and your character falls into the river.
Yeah.
And if the bridge falls, you cannot blame the game developer. You cannot say the developer had a personal vendetta against you. And you certainly can't say it was the destiny of the bridge to fall. It fell because your engineering violated the structural laws of the game.
That is a perfect encapsulation of Parwez's argument.
Mm.
But Parwez adds one crucial, absolute hinge to this dynamic. God imposes a strict limitation on himself in this human sphere.
Which is what?
Absolute non-interference in human choice.
Absolute non-interference, meaning no safety nets, no invisible hand reaching down to catch the bridge before it collapses.
None. Zero.
Mm.
And that self-imposed limitation is terrifying for most people. We inherently seek comfort in the idea of a cosmic parent, a micromanager who will step in and stop us from making a truly disastrous civilizational mistake.
Yeah, or someone who will magically fix our societal brokenness if we just perform the right rituals or ask nicely enough.
Exactly. Parwez's reading of the text just shatters that comfort.
It means absolute freedom requires absolute systemic responsibility. That is incredibly heavy. I mean, if your society is failing, you can't point a finger at the sky.
No, you can't.
You have to look at your own blueprints. You have to audit your own supply chains, your justice system, your wealth distribution. There is literally nowhere to hide.
There is nowhere to hide, which is precisely why human societies actively flee from this framework. It is exhausting to be entirely responsible for your own socioeconomic reality. And this is the pivot point for Parwez's scathing critique of how societies use fatalism to dodge accountability.
Right.
When you embrace takdir, when you embrace predestination, you create an impenetrable psychological shield against systemic critique.
Let's make this concrete, because Parwez gives an incredibly visceral example in his writings regarding mechanical failures and disasters. He talks about how a society poisoned by fatalism reacts to an airplane crash.
Yes, and it highlights the devastating practical consequences of this philosophy. He notes that if a society attributes every outcome to inshallah, meaning if God wills, they fundamentally destroy their ability to progress or course correct.
Walk through how that actually looks in practice. An airplane goes down. Tragically, hundreds of people die. In a rational cause and effect society, what happens?
Well, in a rational society operating on the principles of LME, recognizing the absolute laws of physics, an airplane crash triggers an immediate, rigorous investigation.
Of course.
The National Transportation Safety Board, or an equivalent body, is called in. They recover the black box. They analyze the aerodynamics. They audit the maintenance logs to see if a mechanic cut corners. They investigate pilot fatigue. They treat the crash as a violation of a natural law caused either by human error or mechanical failure.
They treat it as a bug in human engineering that must be identified and fixed so the next plane doesn't fall out of the sky.
Exactly. But Parwez asks, what happens in a society completely subdued by fatalism? If the cultural consensus is it was their time to die, it was written, God willed it, what is the logical next step?
There is no next step. That's the horror of it.
Right.
If you genuinely believe the crash was a pre-written event executed by the universe, investigating the mechanics is totally pointless. In fact, investigating it might even be viewed as a lack of faith, like you're questioning the divine plan.
Precisely. If a crash is deemed fate, you don't need an inquiry commission. You don't need to look at the black box. By blaming destiny, the society inadvertently covers up human incompetence.
Oh, wow.
The airline executives who underfunded the maintenance department, they're let off the hook. The safety inspectors who fell asleep on the job, let off the hook.
It's the ultimate liability waiver.
It is. Fatalism destroys structural accountability, it halts engineering progress, and it mathematically guarantees that the exact same disaster will happen again. Because the systemic flaw was never addressed. It was just outsourced to fate.
Okay, this raises a massive red flag for me. If fatalism is this destructive to a society's progress, if it literally guarantees repeated failures and stagnation, who actually benefits from keeping this belief alive? Because an idea doesn't survive for centuries unless it serves somebody's interests.
That is the exact question Parwez asked, and he points directly at existing power structures. Specifically, he targets the institutional religious establishment, the professional clergy, which the text refers to as Ambar and Reuben.
Let's define those terms, because we're not just talking about your friendly neighborhood spiritual guide here, right? We are talking about a historical class of people.
We are talking about an institutionalized class of gatekeepers. Historically, Abar refers to religious scholars or clerics, and Ruban refers to monks or ascetics. But Parwez uses them to describe the entire socio-political apparatus that monopolizes the interpretation of reality.
A middleman.
They act as the middleman between the people and the truth. And Parwez argues that these institutions maintain their tremendous power and wealth precisely by stripping the masses of their agency.
Because if the masses realize they have the do-what-you-will power, the ikhtiar, they don't need the middleman anymore.
Exactly. If the universal laws are objective and accessible to anyone willing to observe cause and effect, the monopoly of the clergy collapses. So the clergy needs tools to maintain control. And Parwez identifies their ultimate weapon for overriding the objective constitution, a concept known as abrogation, or mansuk.
The concept of abrogation. Man, this part of the source material completely derailed my understanding of how texts function. It is next-level institutional manipulation. Break down what mansuk actually claims.
Abrogation is the institutional claim that certain constitutional verses of the Quran, verses that are physically written, visible, and legible in the text, are essentially null and void in their application.
Wait, so the words are right there on the page, but they don't apply?
According to this doctrine, yes. The clergy claims that while the text remains historically, its actual legal or societal ruling has been magically erased, or more commonly, replaced by invisible rules that aren't actually found anywhere in the book, but are known exclusively by the clerical elite through external traditions.
The political audacity of that is just staggering. I want to frame this in a way that highlights the sheer absurdity of it.
Go for it.
Imagine if the Supreme Court of a constitutional republic held a press conference tomorrow and said, yes, citizens, the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech is written in the Constitution. You can go to the archives and read the ink on the parchment right now.
Okay, yeah.
However, we have decided that the legal force of the First Amendment was abrogated by an invisible, unwritten amendment. This invisible amendment wasn't written down anywhere you can read it, but we, the 9 justices, have exclusive historical knowledge of it, and we declare that free speech is now illegal.
It would be a bloodless coup. It completely nullifies the written legal framework.
It means the written law doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is whatever the person in power tells you the invisible law is. It is the ultimate hack. If you can convince people that the text they can read is superseded by a text they can't read, you have absolute control over reality.
It is the ultimate consolidation of power. If the written constitution can be bypassed by unwritten, invisible authority, then the people have no objective standard by which to hold their leaders accountable.
They can just say, you're not enlightened enough to get it.
Exactly. The leaders can just claim, you don't understand the hidden nuances. And Parwez provides a very specific, factual, historical example to illustrate how deadly this mechanism is. The law of Raj, or stoning.
Let's dig into that example. How does stoning connect to invisible laws?
Parwes points out a stark, verifiable fact. The punishment of stoning a person to death is entirely absent from the text of the Quran. It simply isn't there.
And not a single mention.
Not for the crimes typically associated with it today, no. The text prescribes a very different, specific, and bounded punishment for certain severe social infractions, which is stripes or lashes. It is physically written. Yet for centuries, various religious establishments have actively pushed for and executed the punishment of stoning.
How do they justify that if it contradicts the physical book they claim to uphold?
They have to rely entirely on the doctrine of abrogation. They claim unwritten authority over the text. They argue that the physical text of the Quran doesn't actually mean what it clearly says, and that a harsher, unwritten law found in external clerical traditions somehow supersedes it.
Wow.
They use mansukh to overwrite the Constitution with their own institutional desires.
So combine these two massive concepts. You have a society paralyzed by the passive bug of fatalism. They think every failure is God's will, so they never fix their systems.
Right.
And on top of that, you have an institutional elite enforcing invisible laws, telling the people that the actual Constitution doesn't mean what it says. You have a population that won't investigate a plane crash because it's fate, and they won't challenge an unjust ruling because the clergy claims exclusive access to the real invisible truth. It is a perfectly sealed, airtight trap.
A trap meticulously constructed over centuries. But the purpose of Parwes's work is not just to map the trap, it is to point to the exit. And that exit is found in his analysis of Surah Fusilat, specifically Ayat 40, which offers a radical, strictly rational alternative to this fatalistic nightmare.
This is where we get to a phrase that completely threw me when I encountered it in the sources. 4 words in Arabic, amawi mashitum. And the translation Parwes provides is, well, it's unprecedented. It translates to, do what you will.
Do what you will.
That sounds like something out of an existentialist manifesto or maybe the motto of an anarchist collective. How is that not just an invitation to total societal chaos?
I know, it sounds counterintuitive.
It feels completely contradictory to the idea of a structured religious text. Usually these texts are all about constraint, right? Like, don't do this, don't eat that, pray this many times. To hear do what you will is jarring.
It is jarring because we have been conditioned by the Abar and Ruban to view these texts as ledgers of microscopic behavioral control. Parwes frames this phrase not as an invitation to chaos, but as the ultimate declaration of absolute socioeconomic autonomy.
Autonomy.
Yeah, it is a profound decentralization of power from the heavens to the earth.
So it's not a threat, like, do what you will, but I'll punish you later if you guess wrong.
Not at all. When the universal lawgiver, the architect of the system, says do what you will, it is an explicit structural confirmation of the Alamé Kalk, that human sphere of agency we discussed earlier.
Right, the exception to the rule.
Exactly. It is the creator of the physics engine saying to humanity, I have established the objective laws of cause and effect. I have programmed gravity, thermodynamics, the structural laws of sociology. Now the earthly domain is entirely yours. You are the architects of your own society. Do what you will. It grants humans the dignity and the terror of total responsibility.
It's almost like humanity is handed the keys to a massive, incredibly complex nuclear power plant.
Oh, that's a good one.
The instruction manual is on the desk, and the creator just walks out the door and says, do what you will, but remember, if you push the wrong buttons, the reactor melts down, and there is no backup generator.
That is the exact stakes Parwes is outlining. But this raises the obvious question, right? If we have this absolute agency and the creator has left the building, how do we know if we are doing it right?
Right. If there is no mystical voice coming from the sky to say, good job, what is the metric for success?
This necessitates another major retranslation Parwes does in the text. The phrase Radi Allahu anhum, which is traditionally almost universally translated as God is pleased with them.
Yes, and Parwes fiercely rejects the sentimental, emotional translation of this phrase.
He really does.
We have to violently discard the image of a deity sitting on a cloud feeling the emotion of happiness because a group of humans performed a ritual correctly or recited a chant. Parwes argues that Radiallahu anhum does not mean emotional pleasure. It means systemic alignment.
Systemic alignment. So it's a structural term, not an emotional one.
Exactly. Think of the universe, the Alami Amr, as a vast, perfectly rational machine running flawlessly on the laws of cause and effect.
Okay.
When a human society uses its agency, its do-what-you-will power, to construct socioeconomic laws that are equitable, scientifically grounded, and just, their human system begins to align with the objective universal laws. It's like a newly milled cog slotting perfectly into a massive turning gear.
And when it slots in perfectly, the machine runs smoothly.
Yes, the universal system approves, but that approval isn't a feeling, it is a mathematical output. The approval manifests as tangible success. It looks like stability, scientific progress, eradication of poverty, and societal well-being.
Yeah.
Radi Alohanam simply means the human mechanism is running in perfect, frictionless harmony with the universal mechanism.
That reframes everything. It means your economic indicators, your infant mortality rates, your levels of systemic corruption, the strength of your infrastructure. These aren't just secular statistics. These are the actual metrics of divine pleasure.
They are the feedback loop of the universe.
So if your society is starving, if your bridges are collapsing, if your people are oppressed, it doesn't matter how many temples you build or how loudly you pray. The system is rejecting your structural inputs.
Yeah.
You are fundamentally out of alignment. The engine is grinding its gears.
And this structural logic forces us to confront the great paradox that fatalists always use to defend their position.
Oh, verse 76.30.
Exactly. There is a famous verse in the Quran, 76.30, which says, "But you cannot will unless Allah wills."
Ah, yes. That is the ultimate gotcha verse for fatalists.
Yeah.
On the surface, if you read that through the lens of the Persian sabotage we talked about at the beginning, it sounds like a complete cancellation of Amalum Mashitam.
It really does. It sounds like the creator handing you the keys to the power plant, saying, do what you will, and then immediately whispering, but actually you can't do anything because I have a remote control and I'm pulling the strings anyway. How does Parwez reconcile that glaring contradiction? Because those two concepts, absolute free will and you cannot will unless God wills, they seem totally irreconcilably at odds.
He reconciles it not through mysticism, but purely through rational translation and structural logic. He argues that you cannot will unless Allah wills is not a magical override of human agency.
Okay, so what is it?
It is not the remote control taking over. It is instead profoundly logical, structural advice.
Walk me through that logic.
What the verse means, according to Parwez, is for your own ultimate benefit and for your own survival, you should align your will with what the universal system requires.
Oh, I see.
You have the absolute freedom to will whatever you want. To use our earlier analogy, you could will to build a suspension bridge out of wet cardboard and string. You possess the ikhtiar, the agency, to make that choice.
But the bridge won't stand.
Exactly. Because the universal law of physics, the Alam Yamr, wills that wet cardboard cannot support that weight. Therefore, if you want your bridge to stand, you cannot simply impose your arbitrary, uneducated desires onto reality. You must align your engineering will with the objective mathematical laws of the universe.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It's not taking away your choice, it's telling you how to make a choice that actually survives contact with reality. It's the ultimate warning. Don't fight the physics engine because the physics engine always wins.
Exactly. And this ties perfectly into Parwez's frequent references to the philosopher and poet Allama Iqbal. Iqbal's whole philosophical project resonates with this. He argued that the ultimate goal of humanity is not to somehow magically force the universe to bend to your petty individual desires through prayer or ritual.
Right.
The goal is to elevate your desires, to educate your will so that it perfectly matches the objective laws of the universe.
You don't ask reality to change for you. You transform your society so it operates in harmony with reality. You learn the laws of aerodynamics so you can fly, rather than praying for gravity to turn off.
That is the essence of a rationally governed society. And as we synthesize all these threads, from the geopolitical sabotage of the Persians to the physics engine of universal law, we arrive at the grand, sweeping conclusion of Parwez's deep dive into this text.
Yeah.
Through his lens, the Quran is systematically stripped of all magical, theological, and sentimental framing. It is not a book of spells. It is not a ledger of invisible sins managed by a clerical elite.
It is presented strictly as a manual for cause and effect sociology.
Precisely. And the implications are uncompromising. If a society is poor, if it is failing, if it is lagging behind in science, or if it is crushed under the weight of tyranny and oppression, that is not a divine test sent from the heavens. It is not a mystery of faith, and it is most certainly not fate or takdir. It is a catastrophic failure of human system management. It means the society has built an unjust structure, relied on fatalism to avoid accountability, and allowed institutions to overwrite the objective laws of success with invisible, self-serving rules. The blame and the responsibility to fix it rests entirely on human shoulders.
It's a heavy realization, but honestly, if you strip away the initial shock, it's also incredibly empowering. Because if we are entirely responsible for our own ruin, we are also entirely capable of our own rescue.
Exactly. We have the power.
There is no passive bug unless we choose to let it run in our code. We have the do what you will authority to rewrite our systems. But hearing all of this, looking at how the concept of fatalism completely paralyzed ancient empires and allowed institutions to hijack reality, it makes you look at our modern world a little differently.
It really does.
Think about how we operate today. If human societies are entirely responsible for their own rise and fall, with zero supernatural bailouts coming to save the day, what does that mean for the passive ways we as a modern society sit around waiting for political, technological, or institutional saviors to fix everything for us? Are we secretly relying on our own modern version of Takdir to avoid taking responsibility for our broken systems?